What happens when over 8,000 African professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, choose to leave the West, not because they were pushed out, but because something deeper pulled them home? When the choice is no longer about staying for comfort, but returning for purpose. It began quietly, a speech broadcast not across continents, but into hearts. A voice that didn't command, but called. From dusty fields to abandoned clinics, from shuttered schools to silent villages, they came back. Among them was a belief, steady and simple, that home could be built better by its own. At the center of it all, a young leader stood not with promises, but with a question. What if we returned? Not just our bodies, but our brilliance. His name is Ibrahim Traore, and this is the story of what followed. Stay with us, because what you're about to see might just change the way you think about Africa. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe. You'll want to follow this all the way through. The ground crew is overwhelmed. Planes aren't arriving on schedule anymore. They're overlapping. Immigration lines wrap around the terminal, not from bureaucracy, but from sheer numbers. These aren't chaotic travelers. These are professionals, focused, silent. A few are trembling. Many are crying. One little girl clutches her father's hand and asks, "Is this really home?" He kneels and nods, "Yes, and we're here to fix it together." Inside the crowd is Dr. Hale Lima Sori. For 11 years, she practiced neurology in Paris, but she hasn't smiled like this in a decade. In her duffel bag, redesigned specs for equipment that could function without European oversight. Medical journals filled with notes scribbled in Moor, alongside French. Surgical techniques she'd adapted in her mind for climates where air conditioning fails and power grids collapse. In her heart, a promise she made to her dying Aunt Mariam, who never got treatment in time. The old woman had spent 3 days waiting for transport to Ouagadougou. By the time they reached the hospital, the stroke had claimed too much of her brain. The doctors there, overwhelmed and under-equipped, could only offer morphine for the pain. Mariam died, holding Haile Lima's medical school certificate. Whispered prayers mixing with the beeping of machines that arrived too late to matter. No Burkina should die just because they were born far from machines, she says softly to herself. The same words she'd repeated every morning in her Parisian apartment overlooking the Seine. Every successful surgery she performed in France felt hollow when she remembered her aunt's eyes, the way they searched the ceiling for answers that never came. Near her, Zachary Barrow closes his laptop. He's already running diagnostics on the airport's outdated digital system. The security infrastructure here is from 2003, patched with donations from 3 different countries, none of whom bothered to make their systems compatible. It's a digital house of cards held together by hope and duct tape. He spent 7 years at Microsoft in Seattle, but never got used to winter, or to the way people looked at his skin in high-end boardrooms, the way conversations paused when he entered, the way colleagues complimented his English as if it were surprising, the way his innovations were credited to his white supervisors in quarterly reports. He taps into the airport's Wi-Fi and with a few commands starts patching a firewall vulnerability that's been exposing passenger data to anyone with basic hacking skills. He smiles as clean code flows across his screen. "Back online," he mutters. Not just the system, but his soul. Behind him, Dr. Aminata Sawadogo adjusts her hijab and checks her phone for the 100th time. She's a pediatric cardiologist who spent 8 years in Toronto, where she became the youngest department head in the hospital's history. Her specialty was congenital heart defects in infants. Her success rate was 93%, the highest in North America. But success felt meaningless when she knew that children were dying in Burkina Faso from conditions she could fix in her sleep. Simple procedures that required equipment worth less than what her Toronto hospital spent on coffee each month. She'd tried sending money home, funding individual surgeries, but it was like trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon. President Traore doesn't make a speech. He doesn't wave. He walks quiet, watchful, every step measured. He moves through the crowd like water, stopping to shake hands with a mechanic from Germany, embracing a teacher who'd returned from Belgium with her 3 children. Each person he meets, he looks them in the eyes and asks the same question: what will you build first? Around him, returnees begin to chant softly, not his name, but a phrase: we believe. It starts with one voice, spreads to 10, then 50, then hundreds. Not the desperate chant of people seeking salvation, but the confident chorus of architects ready to construct. Reporters try to approach. He raises one hand. No headlines today, just homecoming. A team of young soldiers and medical volunteers organize arrival stations. Each person gets a welcome kit, housing instructions printed in French and more, land claim documents with GPS coordinates to their allocated plots, health screening forms that ask not just about diseases but about skills and dreams, and a government ID with one bold word stamped across the top: returnee. That word carries weight. In the West, many of these professionals were immigrants, foreigners, or worse, refugees. Here, they are pillars of national rebirth. Their ID cards serve as instant qualifications, bypassing bureaucratic red tape. A returnee ID gets you priority access to government services, fast-tracked business licenses, and most importantly, respect. Outside the terminal, a massive red banner flaps above a newly constructed facility, Burkina Faso Medical and Tech Academy, built by the Diaspora for the future. The building itself tells a story. Solar panels cover every surface, their angles optimized by returning engineers. The architecture blends traditional Sahelian design with modern functionality. Thick walls provide natural cooling, while glass facades maximize natural light. Dozens of young students, most from rural villages, gather in awe. They've only read about these kinds of people in textbooks that portrayed brilliance as something that existed only in faraway places. Now they're here, smiling, shaking hands, ready to teach. The students clutch notebooks filled with questions they've been saving their entire lives. A local grandmother approaches one of the returnees unsure. She's heard stories, but seen nothing. Government promises had come and gone like seasonal rains, announced with fanfare, delivering disappointment. "You speak more?" she asks softly, testing whether this educated man from abroad remembers the language of his childhood. He nods and responds fluently, his accent carrying traces of Canadian English but the grammar perfectly intact. "I never forgot." The words he chooses are formal, respectful, the way children are taught to address elders. She places a small calabash bowl in his hand, filled with peanuts she grew herself. "Then, you are one of us. It's not just food, it's a ceremony, an acceptance that cannot be bought or faked." Across the capital, news spreads like fire. Radios blast the headline: 8,000 professionals have returned. Doctors, engineers, farmers, coders. The numbers feel impossible in a country where university graduates traditionally left as soon as their diplomas were signed. WhatsApp groups explode. One message reads, "This is not a government stunt. This is real. They came back, and they're staying." Photos flood social media. Planes unloading families. Children in winter coats, looking around in wonder. Suitcases stacked beside baobab trees. The imagery is surreal and beautiful. But not everyone is smiling. In a quiet office on the 3rd floor of the European Union Delegation Building, 2 embassy officials look at the arrival stats displayed on dual monitors. The numbers don't lie. Medical professionals leaving European hospitals. Engineers departing tech firms. Teachers abandoning international schools. "This is a problem," one whispers, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he scrolls through departure manifests. If they stay, this could shift everything. We've trained them, paid them, built systems around them. Our hospitals have waiting lists because we assumed African doctors would always be available to fill gaps. The other replies coldly, sipping coffee from a mug emblazoned with the EU flag. Then maybe we should have given them a reason to stay. Maybe we should have treated them like partners instead of assets. Back at the airport, a Burkina journalist asks one returnee, why leave six-figure jobs? Why leave New York, London, Toronto? The microphone catches the ambient sound of families reuniting, children asking questions in languages they're struggling to remember, and the steady hum of hope mixed with uncertainty. The answer is simple, raw, because we don't want our children to grow up building someone else's dream. It's time to build ours. And so, the streets begin to change. Pharmacies open overnight, staffed by returnee doctors who work 18-hour days because the need is overwhelming and the joy is intoxicating. Clinics expand from single rooms to multi-story facilities. Solar panels get installed by engineers who've been dreaming of this moment since their first day in foreign universities. Engineering tools arrive in crates marked with returning names. Each box contains not just equipment but hope, made tangible. One child walks into a library and finds a new section. Diaspora contributions. Inside is a photo of the day the first 8,000 came home. Below it, a quote handwritten by a returning teacher. They didn't come to take. They came to return what was always theirs. As night falls, the president finally speaks on national radio, his voice low and clear. We are not rebuilding what colonization destroyed. We are building what they never wanted us to dream. Silence follows, then music, then hope. But in the shadow of that joy, foreign powers begin to whisper. Because if one nation can bring back 8,000 of its best minds, what happens when the entire continent hears the call? Rewind 48 hours. The night was still. No fireworks, no press teasers, just a national broadcast, unannounced, beginning with static that cleared like morning fog. Then his face appeared, calm, centered, unshaken. The backdrop was deliberately simple. A flag, a desk, a map. Captain Ibrahim Traore sat behind a plain wooden desk that had been carved by local artisans, not imported from European furniture showrooms. No military medals adorned his chest, no ceremonial sash across his shoulder. Only a small carved map of Burkina Faso beside him, its borders traced in gold by craftsmen from Bobo Dioulasso. He spoke with the clarity of someone who had waited his whole life to say what was coming. The words had been rehearsed not in front of mirrors, but during long walks through villages where children played with sticks because they had never seen real toys, where mothers gave birth by candlelight because electricity was a luxury reserved for the capital. We don't need donations, he began. Voice measured, like a master drummer setting rhythm for a ceremony. The pause that followed was not for dramatic effect, but for breath, for strength to carry words that would travel across oceans and into hearts that had been waiting for decades to hear them. We need you, all of you. Another pause. Then he leaned forward, the camera tight on his face, close enough to see the sincerity in his eyes, but not so close as to feel invasive. You, the son working at a hospital in Brussels, saving European lives while your grandmother dies, waiting for medicine that costs less than a cup of coffee in your cafeteria. You, the daughter developing tech in Atlanta, writing code that makes American companies billions, while your village still communicates by drumbeat because phone towers were never deemed profitable enough to install. You, the mother raising Burkina children in Oslo, teaching them to speak Norwegian while they forget the songs their great-grandmothers used to sing to chase away nightmares. We see you, and we truly need you here now. Not someday, not when it's convenient, not when your foreign careers reach their peak and you're ready to retire in comfort. Now, while your hands are strong and your minds are sharp and your hearts still remember what home sounds like. Across the world, screens lit up. In diaspora communities that had learned to keep their homesickness private, phones buzzed with unprecedented urgency. WhatsApp groups that usually shared wedding photos and funeral announcements suddenly carried links to a speech no one had expected but everyone had been waiting for. In cafes in Paris, the Burkina community turned their heads toward a laptop screen someone had angled so everyone could see. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee grew cold. The usual discussions about French politics and European weather gave way to something deeper, more urgent. In Berlin, students paused their lectures. One young man studying engineering at Technical University excused himself from class, walked to the bathroom, and called his mother in Ouagadougou. The conversation was brief, but changed everything. "I'm coming home," he said. She cried for 10 minutes without saying a word. In New York, one nurse on a night shift at Mount Sinai stopped mid-injection, apologized to her patient, turned the volume up on her phone and whispered, "Is this really real?" The patient, an elderly Jewish man who had fled persecution decades earlier, looked at her and said, "When someone calls you home after so long, you listen." Traore continued, his voice rising slightly but never breaking into shouting. "Our land is rich, but wealth buried is not wealth lived. And who better to unearth it than our very own? You know our climate, our culture, our challenges. You understand what solutions will work because you remember what problems feel like. We are not asking for your pity. Charity is for beggars, and we are not beggars. We are calling for your purpose. You have the tools forged in foreign universities and refined in foreign workplaces. We have the soil that raised you, the challenges that shaped you, the dreams that sent you away, and the wisdom that calls you back. You have the tools. We have the soil. Come home." No music swelled, no applause track played. Just silence that carried more weight than any orchestral crescendo. But in that silence, a storm began. Not the destructive kind that tears down buildings, but the generative kind that plants seeds in prepared ground. In a high-rise apartment in Toronto overlooking Lake Ontario, a software architect named Bukari Diawara stood up from his ergonomic desk chair, shut his MacBook Pro with its dozens of optimization algorithms for Canadian banking systems, and stared at the screen of his iPhone. The reflection of his apartment, all modern furniture and abstract art chosen more for status than personal connection, seemed suddenly foreign. His wife Aisha emerged from the bedroom where she had been reading to their 2 children, stories about Canadian heroes and European fairy tales. "Are you quitting now?" she asked, recognizing something in his posture that she hadn't seen since their wedding day. Certainty mixed with terror. He nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling into his bones like medicine that tastes bitter but heals completely. "Yes, we're going home finally." "But the house," she started, thinking of their mortgage and their children's private school tuition and the life they had constructed with such careful planning. "The kids' school, your promotion, the security." "What security?" he asked, not angry but genuinely curious. "Security to live as permanent guests in someone else's country? Security to watch our children forget their grandparents' names? Security to send money home to fix problems we could solve ourselves if we were there?" In Lyon, a medical student named Fatou Billy played the clip again and again, pausing at moments that hit too close to home. When Traore spoke about grandmothers dying while grandsons saved foreign lives, she thought of her own grandmother Khadija, who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident. Khadija had sold everything she owned to pay for Fatou's education, working in markets and taking in washing until her hands were permanently stained with soap and her back was permanently bent from carrying loads too heavy for her aging frame. The old woman had died while Fatou was in her second year of medical school in France, during final exams that couldn't be postponed for funerals. Fatou's friends told her to calm down, to think rationally, to consider her future. She didn't. Instead, she opened a group chat and typed 3 words: Mission Return, Burkina Faso. In 6 hours, it had 300 members. By morning, it had crossed into other countries and other universities. In Bamako, a mechanic named Ibrahim forwarded the speech to his cousin Musa in Italy. Musa worked in a factory that made luxury cars for people who earned in a month what his entire village earned in a year. The cousin had never considered going back to Mali, but by midnight he was researching flight prices and visa requirements for returning to Africa. The phrase, "We need you," exploded across TikTok, Instagram, Telegram. Influencers who never talked about politics reposted the clip with captions like, "This one hit deep," and "First time a president made me cry." But it wasn't just the words that went viral. It was the authenticity. In an age of scripted politicians and focus group-tested messages, here was a leader speaking without notes, without teleprompters, without the careful language of diplomacy. His French carried the accent of the soil, not the salon. His pauses came from emotion, not calculation. In Washington, D.C., State Department analysts flagged the video within hours of its release. A memo circulated through secure channels read, "Unprecedented diaspora mobilization. Potential shift in skilled migration flows. Recommend monitoring." But their institutional response was too slow for social media speed. By morning, WhatsApp groups across the African diaspora had changed names. Burkina Homerant, Come Home and Build, Roots Before Riches. Return portals on the Burkina Faso government website crashed from traffic as servers designed to handle hundreds of requests per day suddenly received thousands per hour. And Traore hadn't even said the most powerful line yet. It came at the end of his 17-minute address, quiet, almost like a whisper, but clear enough to carry across continents. They told you Africa is hard, but I tell you, Africa is waiting. The camera held on his face for 10 seconds after he finished speaking. No fade to black, no cut to music. Just a man sitting at a desk having said what needed to be said. Then the screen went dark and the silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. That line didn't inspire, it ignited. At a train station in London, a young architect named Samui Coulibaly was heading to a meeting with clients who wanted to build another shopping mall in a city that already had too many. He stopped walking when the notification popped up on his phone. The video played through his earphones as he sat on a bench designed to be uncomfortable enough to prevent homeless people from sleeping. Instead of boarding his train to the meeting, he opened his laptop and filled out an application for Burkina Faso's Mission Renaissance program. The clients could build their own mall. He had more important work to do. That same day, he received an automated email confirming his application and a personal note from someone in the Ministry of Infrastructure. "We've reviewed your portfolio. When can you start?" 2 weeks later, he was on a flight home. The government hadn't planned for this speed. They expected a few dozen applications, maybe 100, in the first month. Instead, over 2,000 arrived in 72 hours. Engineers, surgeons, teachers, cyber analysts, not out of desperation, but out of love. The applications themselves told stories. One applicant wrote, "I spent 15 years trying to be accepted abroad. I'd rather spend 15 building my own soil now." Another added, "My degree was framed in gold, but my father still couldn't get medicine back home. That ends now finally." A surgeon from Montreal included photographs of the rural clinic where she had volunteered during her last visit home. "I can fix hearts here," she wrote, "but I can't fix the system that breaks them. Let me come home and build something that lasts." Across Burkina Faso villages, radios replayed the speech with translation into local languages, Moor, Diola, Fulfulde. Elders sat in circles under baobab trees, nodding slowly as the translated words confirmed what they had always known but rarely heard acknowledged. Their children had not left because they didn't love home, but because home had been made impossible to love. One elderly man in Gorsi said to his grandson, "I never thought I'd see the day when leaving wasn't the dream, but coming back was." Meanwhile, in foreign universities, professors noticed a shift that initially seemed insignificant but grew more pronounced each day. Bright African students, once eager to stay and pursue graduate degrees, once desperate for work visas and permanent residency, began asking about transfer options and early graduation requirements. One university dean at McGill privately asked his colleague, "What if they all go back just like that?" The question carried more fear than curiosity. African students had become essential to maintaining enrollment numbers and research productivity. Losing them would mean losing funding, prestige, and competitive advantage. Not everyone was pleased. In Brussels, a policy roundtable on African development broke into heated debate when someone mentioned the Burkina Faso speech. One participant, representing a consortium of European NGOs, warned, "If this return movement grows, it will destabilize our sectors. We have programs, infrastructure, relationships built around the assumption that African talent will remain available to us." Another participant, an economist from the African Development Bank, replied coolly, "Maybe it's not destabilization, maybe it's justice. Maybe it's time we asked ourselves why we designed systems that required Africans to abandon Africa in order to succeed." Finally, back in Ouagadougou, Traore met with his team in a conference room lit by solar-powered LED lights. His advisors were still processing the response, phones ringing with interview requests from BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera. Social media metrics scrolled across laptop screens, showing engagement rates that political consultants only dream about. One said, "Sir, this might really change everything." He responded with a firm nod. "That's the point. We're not managing decline anymore. We're orchestrating return." They began drafting support packages, legal protections, and infrastructure plans for the returnees. Schools were prepared to receive children who spoke French fluently but couldn't count to 10 and more. Hospitals were given hiring priority lists and fast-track licensing procedures. Housing cooperatives were established to help families transition from European apartments to African compounds. At the center of it all, a map marked not with borders, but with opportunity zones. Areas where returnees could establish businesses, build clinics, start schools, launch technology centers. Each zone came with infrastructure commitments, reliable electricity, internet connectivity, and transportation links. The first return flight was scheduled for the following week. It filled in 24 hours. Then a second, then a third. Air France and Brussels Airlines added extra flights from European cities with large Burkinab populations. Each time someone asked, "Why are they coming?" the answer never changed, because one man spoke and the world truly listened. Do you believe Traore's message can reshape a nation? Comment Amen below if you stand with him. The next part of this story won't be told by presidents or policies. It will be told by those boarding planes with nothing but a suitcase and a belief, those who walked away from comfort and into the unknown because they heard something no one else had said to them in years. You are wanted. You are needed. You belong. And now, they are coming. The question is, who's next? 2 days after the speech, the official announcement hit national radio at exactly 6 a.m., time to catch people during their morning routines, when attention is highest and skepticism is lowest. The government of Burkina Faso had launched Mission Renaissance, not a campaign, not a plea, but a comprehensive plan that had been months in development. waiting for the right moment to launch. It wasn't improvised hope, it was engineered return. The program offered what no African government had ever offered its diaspora: full integration support that treated returning professionals not as charity cases, but as essential infrastructure. Free land grants and development zones were mapped and surveyed, with GPS coordinates and soil analyses already complete. Priority job placements in public sectors came with fast-track credentialing that recognized foreign qualifications without bureaucratic delays. The reintegration package included housing assistance, not temporary shelter, but help securing permanent homes. Tuition coverage for children. Transitioning into local schools, with specialized programs for those who spoke foreign languages better than local ones. National recognition of foreign qualifications meant a doctor trained in Canada could practice immediately without spending years recertifying. Most importantly, each returnee received legal protections against discrimination and bureaucratic harassment. Anyone who hindered a returnee's integration faced personal consequences from the president's office. The first press release was 1 page long, printed on paper manufactured in Burkina Faso, from trees grown in Burkina Faso, by a printing press operated by Burkinab workers. At the bottom of it, Traore's signature appeared next to a single line of text that would become legendary. "They trained you to leave. We prepared to receive." Within hours of the announcement, the Ministry of Infrastructure's email servers crashed from the volume of applications. Its staff worked through the night to upgrade capacity, but applications arrived faster than servers could process them. By the next morning, the picture became clear. Doctors, engineers, IT experts, agricultural scientists, and former military officers had begun submitting dossiers that read like recruitment dreams. Some had left 30 years ago as teenagers, with nothing but hope and scholarship letters. Others had never lived in Burkina Faso at all, only carried it in their names and dreams passed down through generations of exile. Now they were returning with skills, experience, and in many cases capital accumulated from decades of high-paying foreign jobs. The brain drain was becoming a brain flood in reverse. Dr. Aminata Konate, Chief of Cardiology at Toronto General Hospital, submitted a 12-page application detailing plans for a pediatric heart center that would serve all of West Africa. Her proposal included equipment donations from Canadian suppliers, training programs for local staff, and a telemedicine network connecting rural clinics to specialists in Ouagadougou. Mamadou Traore, a software architect who had spent 8 years building trading systems for Wall Street banks, proposed creating a financial technology center that would develop banking solutions for informal economies. His plan included mobile payment systems that worked without internet connectivity and microfinance platforms designed for seasonal agricultural income patterns. Western outlets were quick to respond, but their coverage was revealed more about their assumptions than about Burkina Faso's reality. A headline in The Guardian read, "Burkina Faso launches idealistic homecoming program." The word idealistic carrying condescension disguised as concern. Le Figaro asked, "Can passion replace policy?" As if African governments were incapable of both emotion and competence simultaneously. Television analysts on CNN called it unsustainable, citing examples of failed return programs in other countries without acknowledging the comprehensive planning that differentiated Mission Renaissance from previous efforts. A roundtable discussion on BBC World Service suggested that the loss of African professionals might destabilize global talent markets, revealing concerns about Western dependency on African skills that had never been publicly acknowledged. But the Burkina Faso government wasn't listening to foreign media commentary. They were listening to the returnees themselves, whose applications contained insights no policy think tank could provide. At a televised event broadcast live across West Africa, Minister of Labor Cardi Tomogo stood beside 5 new arrivals who represented the diversity and capability of the return movement. Each had arrived within the previous 48 days, 48 hours, and each carried skills that would immediately impact thousands of lives. Dr. Sarah Ouedraogo, an aerospace engineer who had spent 6 years at Boeing in Houston designing flight navigation systems, now planned to establish a drone manufacturing facility for medical deliveries to remote areas. Mariam Sankara, a trauma nurse who had worked in emergency departments in Lyon and Brussels, would lead the development of a rapid response medical network connecting all major hospitals in the country. Abdoulaye Compaoré, a financial planner who had managed investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions in Toronto, would establish a sovereign wealth fund based on diaspora remittances and local resource management. Dr. Fatimata Sawadogo, a soil researcher from Amsterdam who specialized in desert agriculture, would lead efforts to reclaim farmland lost to desertification using techniques developed in Israeli kibbutzim, but adapted for Sahelian conditions. Amadou Zongo, a renewable energy technician from Oslo who had installed solar systems across Scandinavia, would oversee the electrification of rural schools and health clinics using locally manufactured panels. Cameras rolled as Minister Tomogo handed each of them a welcome certificate printed on handmade paper, a national ID card that would give them instant access to government services, and a symbolic piece of clay from the region where they'd been granted land. The clay wasn't just ceremony. Each piece came from soil that had been tested for agricultural potential, surveyed for mineral content, and selected for specific development projects. Dr. Ouedraogo's clay came from a site outside Bobo Dioulasso, where the drone facility would be built. Mariam's came from land near the new medical training center. Each handful of earth represented concrete opportunity. "You are not guests," Minister Tomogo said, with conviction that carried across radio waves and into diaspora communities worldwide. "You are home now fully and truly. You are not here to visit or volunteer. You are here to own and build and stay." The most powerful moment came when a young mother stepped to the microphone. Her name was Rokia Tapsoba, and her story would become emblematic of why the return movement mattered beyond economics or politics. She had been living in Germany for 12 years, working as a midwife in a Stuttgart hospital, where she delivered babies for families who saw her as competent but never as equal. Her German was flawless. Her skills were exceptional, but her acceptance was always conditional. In perfect German-accented French that carried traces of her childhood in Kudugu, she said, "My daughter Aicha was born in Germany, but I want her to grow up in a place where her skin is not a reason to be watched, where her name is not shortened for someone's convenience, where her presence is expected, rather than constantly questioned and explained." She paused, looking down at her daughter, who clung to her leg with the confusion that comes from being uprooted from everything familiar. In Germany, Aicha was always the African girl in her class. Here she will simply be Aicha, and that will be enough. The applause lasted 4 minutes and was picked up by microphones and broadcast across 3 countries. But more importantly, it was recorded by phones and shared across social media platforms, where it would reach millions of African parents living abroad and wrestling with the same questions about identity, belonging, and the price of opportunity. Meanwhile, ministries across the government began mobilizing with efficiency that surprised even internal planners. The Ministry of Health released a list of over 120 priority hospital posts, each with detailed job descriptions, salary ranges, and community context. Rural hospitals in need of surgeons received applications from doctors trained at Harvard and Oxford. Urban clinics requiring specialists found themselves choosing between candidates with decades of experience in top European medical centers. The Ministry of Agriculture made tractors and irrigation equipment available to returning farmers at cost, with maintenance training and spare parts guarantees. Agricultural engineers who had studied soil reclamation in California and water management in Australia suddenly found themselves with resources to implement solutions they had only theorized about in foreign universities. The Ministry of Technology launched a digital portal where coders and system architects could directly pitch projects to national agencies. Within 48 hours, the portal received proposals for upgrading the national power grid, modernizing the banking system, and creating educational software in local languages. For the first time in the country's history, the return of the diaspora wasn't treated as a favor to be appreciated, but as a national strategy to be implemented systematically and successfully. One by one, the names began to pour in. Not just ordinary professionals, but individuals whose return would immediately elevate entire sectors. Dr. Noel Damber, a neurosurgeon with publications in Harvard Medical Review and surgical techniques named after him in 3 medical journals. His application included plans for establishing the first comprehensive brain and spine center between Morocco and South Africa. Yasmin Orago, the first Burkina woman to lead a logistics firm in Dubai, whose company managed supply chains for construction projects across the Middle East. She proposed creating a pan-African logistics hub that would reduce the cost of intracontinental trade by eliminating European middlemen. Idris Sori, the youngest African ever hired as a lead robotics engineer at Tesla, whose innovations in battery management had made electric vehicles practical in extreme climates. His return would bring electric vehicle technology to a continent where transportation costs consumed 40% of household income. When asked by foreign press why they were giving up 6-figure salaries, prestigious positions, and comfortable lives abroad, many answered with variations of the same theme. Because no job abroad will ever mean more than coming home and building something that actually lasts. Inside government halls, some officials worried privately about capacity and expectations. Would this strain resources? Would people reject the returnees as outsiders or privileged elites? Would the infrastructure support such rapid change? But the opposite happened. Communities began organizing welcome meals, where traditional dishes were prepared using recipes that returnee wives had adapted to include ingredients they'd discovered abroad. Rural villages offered plots of land near schools so that returnee children could attend classes while maintaining connection to agricultural communities. Imams and priests gave blessings during Friday and Sunday services, framing return not as abandonment of the outside world, but as fulfillment of religious obligations to strengthen the Ummah and serve the community. One elderly farmer in Kaya gave his old shovel to a young agricultural specialist who had just returned from Sweden with expertise in drought-resistant farming. "My hands are tired," he said gently, pressing the worn wooden handle into younger palms. "Yours are just beginning now and full of strength." It didn't take long before other African nations took notice. News reports from Mali and Togo showed similar movements forming. WhatsApp groups with names like Ghana Rebuild and Return to Nairobi appeared overnight, sharing Burkina Faso's model and adapting strategies for different national contexts. A Nigerian journalist tweeted, "What Traore is doing is not just for Burkina Faso. It's proof of concept for all of us, the entire continent." And yet the opposition continued. An EU development consultant posted a public critique on LinkedIn that revealed more about European anxieties than African realities. Burkina Faso cannot absorb this many professionals without creating economic imbalance, the post read, as if African countries were inherently incapable of managing their own human resources. Traore responded during a radio interview, calm and firm. "We're not absorbing them like foreign aid," he said. "We are returning them to where they were always truly needed." The camera panned to the faces of a classroom full of Burkina children watching doctors teach in their village for the first time in their lives. No one interrupted. No one laughed, because something impossible was happening. The best and brightest were not leaving Africa. They were coming back. And now, with the systems in motion and the movement growing, the challenge ahead was not about whether the return was real. It was about whether the world could truly handle what a united, educated, and empowered Africa might actually build. For 11 years, Dr. Haile Lima Sori was one of the top neurosurgeons at Hôpital de la Salpêtrière in Paris, the hospital where Napoleon's nephew was treated, where Marie Curie brought radium patients, where the most complex cases from across Europe arrived seeking miracles. Fluent in French, German, and English, trained at Sorbonne, respected in every hospital she walked into. Her office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seine, with framed degrees and awards lining the walls like trophies from a war she wasn't sure she wanted to win. She had everything a career could promise: international recognition, financial security, intellectual stimulation, and the respect of peers who represented the pinnacle of medical achievement. Everything except peace. The decision came quietly. One evening in November, after performing a successful procedure on a young girl with a brain tumor, a delicate operation that required removing a growth wrapped around the child's speech center without damaging her ability to communicate, Haile Lima sat in the staff lounge, watching a replay of President Traore's speech on her phone. "We don't need donations, we need you," he had said. But it wasn't the words that broke her. It wasn't the political message or the patriotic appeal. It was the silence that followed. The space between his words where she could hear her own heartbeat and remember why she had become a doctor in the first place. For the first time in her career, she felt her heartbeat line up perfectly with a mission that extended beyond the next surgery, the next promotion, the next publication in a prestigious journal. She didn't tell her colleagues right away, not until she submitted her resignation letter to the department head, a distinguished man who had mentored her through her residency and supported her rise through the hospital hierarchy. Some tried to stop her. Dr. Benoit, her department head, offered her the position she had been working toward for years. "You'll have your own wing," he said, gesturing toward architectural plans spread across his mahogany desk, your name in gold on the plaque front and center. The Haile Lima Sori, Center for Neurological Excellence. But Haile Lima just smiled and replied, "I don't need gold. I need grounding and purpose." Packing up her apartment in the 5th arrondissement took only a weekend. 12 years of life in Paris fit into 6 suitcases and 3 shipping boxes. Her neighbors, other professionals who had never learned her name despite sharing an elevator for over a decade, stared as she loaded medical textbooks into suitcases. One asked if she was taking a sabbatical, perhaps volunteering with Doctors Without Borders in some crisis zone, before returning to resume her real life. "No," she answered. "I'm taking my soul back home where it belongs." She arrived in Bobo Dioulasso with 1 suitcase, 3 laptops loaded with medical software, surgical training videos, and diagnostic programs, and a vision she'd been carrying since childhood: the creation of the country's first specialized trauma and neuro-rehabilitation center. The vision had begun during her medical school years when she'd seen too many patients arrive at teaching hospitals in Ouagadougou with brain injuries that could have been treated successfully if caught earlier. Motorcycle accidents, construction injuries, sports trauma, cases where the difference between full recovery and permanent disability was measured in hours, not days. The land had already been granted under Mission Renaissance. 3 hectares on the edge of a district where injuries were common, but treatment was rare. The plot sat between a busy intersection where traffic accidents occurred weekly and a construction zone where workers operated without safety equipment because helmets and harnesses cost more than daily wages. Locals had long accepted slow death or expensive travel abroad as their only options when serious head injuries occurred. Families sold livestock and borrowed money for trips to Morocco or Tunisia, often arriving too late for treatment to be effective. Haile Lima was determined to change that calculus permanently. In the first 72 hours, she toured old clinics that had been abandoned when international funding dried up, met with village leaders who remembered when medicine men treated head injuries with herbs and prayer, and drew up architectural plans with Burkina engineers who had returned from construction projects in Dubai and Qatar. Her first hire was a young nurse named Nini Tambura, who had been working out of a cramped metal shed with no electricity, treating patients by candlelight, and keeping medical records in handwritten notebooks that she stored in plastic bags to protect from rain. "Are you sure you want to work with me?" Nini asked, embarrassed by her worn shoes and outdated equipment, intimidated by working with someone who had trained at the Sorbonne and published research in international medical journals. Haley Lima looked around the metal shed, at the improvised surgical table made from wooden planks, at the sterilization system that consisted of a propane burner and metal pots, at the pharmacy that was nothing more than a locked wooden box containing expired medications donated by European hospitals. "I've worked in the finest buildings," she said, "but healing doesn't need glass walls. It needs heart and hands that care. And you have both." Construction began 2 weeks later. The center was designed with local climate and constraints in mind. Open-air corridors took advantage of natural wind patterns for cooling while maintaining sterile environments. Solar-powered air conditioning provided backup cooling for operating rooms during the hottest months. Water filtration systems ensured clean water for surgery without depending on municipal supply that often failed during dry season. Trauma triage zones were built using modular design so that capacity could be expanded during accident-prone periods, harvest season when farm machinery injuries spiked, or rainy season when motorcycle accidents increased on muddy roads. Every bed was placed facing a window because Hale Lima believed that healing required connection to the outside world, not isolation from it. Every chart was printed in French and more because medical care in a patient's native language produced better outcomes than care delivered through translation. Donations came, but only from Burkina citizens. Hale Lima refused international aid that came with restrictions on how money could be spent or requirements that equipment be purchased from specific European suppliers at inflated prices. "We build what we own, and we own what we build," she stated clearly during a radio interview that was broadcast across West Africa. Her colleagues in France were stunned when she posted the first image of the half-built center on social media. The photo showed concrete walls rising from red soil, solar panels being installed by local technicians, and medical equipment arriving in trucks marked with Burkina license plates. A reply came from her old supervisor within hours. "You're wasting your talent in a place without proper infrastructure." She replied with a photo of a child walking again after spinal rehabilitation, a boy whose parents had been told he would never leave his wheelchair. Caption: "No talent is wasted when it's finally used for the right people and purpose." 3 months after opening, the center saw its first major case, a motorcycle accident survivor named Umar Tungara, a teacher who had been traveling between villages when his bike skidded on wet Laterite Road during evening rain. He had been told by doctors in Ouagadougou that he'd never walk again, that his spinal injury was too severe for the equipment available in Burkina Faso. Haley Lima and her team treated him for 4 weeks, using techniques she had learned in Paris but adapted for equipment that worked without constant electricity and spare parts that could be manufactured locally. Physical therapy sessions were conducted in courtyards rather than sterile rooms. Recovery exercises incorporated traditional dance movements that engaged core muscles more effectively than European rehabilitation protocols. On the 5th week, he stood up and took 3 full steps. Someone recorded it and uploaded it with the title, "Burkina Faso's First Step Toward Healing." The video went viral, 2 million views in 72 hours. Celebrities reposted it. African health influencers shared her name and story. International medical journals requested interviews, but what mattered more to Hale Lima was the knock at her door the next morning. It was Umar's mother holding a small bag of ground nuts she had grown and processed herself. "You brought my son back," she said softly, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "This is all I have to offer." Hale Lima took it with both hands. "This is all I need truly." The center now operates with a waiting list. Patients come from as far as Ghana and Mali, traveling for days to reach treatment that didn't exist anywhere else in the region. Hale Lima trains young doctors during the day and reads patient journals at night, documenting techniques that work in African contexts with African resources. She's developing a certification program in neurotrauma specifically tailored for African emergency conditions: snake bites that cause neurological damage, mine injuries common in artisanal gold mining, untreated epilepsy that leads to brain trauma from repeated seizures, traffic accidents involving overloaded vehicles, and poor road conditions. It's the first program of its kind on the continent, designed by African doctors for African conditions, using equipment that functions reliably in African environments. She was recently offered a prestigious grant by a European foundation to expand the program. The offer came with requirements that training be conducted in French rather than local languages, that equipment be sourced from European suppliers, and that oversight be provided by European medical boards. She declined. "If you want to support us," she said firmly, "send your students here to learn with us. We don't export our hope anymore. We teach it right here." Her story has inspired others. 2 more neurosurgeons have returned, one from Johannesburg, who specialized in pediatric brain surgery, one from Montreal, who had developed techniques for treating stroke in elderly patients with limited mobility. They joined the trauma center last week, and they're not the last. Applications arrive weekly from specialists across the diaspora who have heard about the center through medical networks and want to contribute to its expansion. When asked during a national radio interview why she made the decision to leave behind everything she had built in Europe, Hale Lima responded without hesitation. "Europe gave me tools," she said, "but home gave me purpose, real purpose." Meanwhile, Zakari Barrow didn't return home with suitcases. He returned with firewalls, encryption scripts, and a blueprint drawn on the back of a napkin during his last flight from Seattle to Paris, before connecting to Ouagadougou. For 8 years, he had worked in the cybersecurity division of a private defense contractor in California, just 20 minutes from the Google campus, where tech innovations that would shape the global internet were developed daily. On paper, he was invisible. Top security clearance, confidential projects, no social media presence. But to those who knew, he was one of the best code architects in the field. The kind of mind that Western intelligence agencies monitored without admitting they were watching. The kind of talent that could build systems to protect nations or networks, to topple governments. And yet, when he watched President Traore's speech, something in him shifted. Not out of nostalgia or romantic notions about returning to his roots, but out of rage that had been building for years. He remembered the night 3 years earlier when his uncle Ibrahim in Burkina Faso had died after a delayed emergency surgery. The 67-year-old man had suffered a heart attack while working in his fields during harvest season. His medical records had been digitized and sent through a third-party server hosted in Belgium as part of a European Union health information system. The records were flagged as a security risk by automated systems that classified medical data from certain African countries as potentially fraudulent. The delay lasted 18 hours while verification protocols were completed. By the time medical history arrived at the hospital in Ouagadougou, Burema had died waiting for surgery that could have saved his life if doctors had known about his previous cardiac episodes. Zakari had filed a quiet inquiry through diplomatic channels. The answer he received chilled him to the bone. System flagged your nation's data as high risk. Standard protocol requires verification. Blocked. That was the word that stuck in his throat for months, the word that turned professional success into personal betrayal. So when Traore said, "We don't need donations, we need you," Zakari didn't blink. He submitted his resignation the next day. His employer countered with a 30% raise, stock options, and promotion to lead architect on a classified project worth hundreds of millions. He sent back 2 words: "I'm done here." He landed in Ouagadougou and didn't wait for welcome ceremonies or press conferences. He went straight to the Ministry of Digital Affairs with a proposal that would revolutionize healthcare data management, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. Replace the entire hospital record-keeping infrastructure with a locally hosted, firewalled, decentralized system coded in country, stored in country, controlled in country. No foreign servers, no external oversight. No risk of essential medical information being blocked by systems that viewed African lives as security threats rather than human beings requiring care. The minister asked, "How long would that take realistically?" Zakari looked at his watch. "Give me a team, 2 weeks, that's all I'll need." They gave him a dusty office in the basement of the ministry building and 5 underpaid IT graduates who had been maintaining outdated systems with donated equipment and pirated software. Zakari renamed the group The Core and transformed that basement into the most advanced cybersecurity operation in West Africa. They slept on beanbags because beds weren't priority when code needed to be written. They ate street food brought by vendors who accepted payment in phone credit when cash ran short. They coded through blackouts using battery-powered laptops and mobile hotspots, and by day 5, a team of signed wows. They had already mapped every weak point in the current system. The network that handled medical records for the entire country was vulnerable to attacks from script kiddies. Patient data was accessible to anyone with basic hacking skills. Critical medications were being prescribed based on incomplete records because different hospitals used incompatible systems. On day 7, they identified 3 active surveillance ports connected to data centers in France, Germany, and Ireland. Medical information about Burkina citizens was being copied to foreign servers without consent, analyzed by algorithms trained to identify health patterns in African populations, and sold to pharmaceutical companies developing medications for markets that excluded the people whose health data had been harvested. Zakari ordered immediate severing of those connections. A junior technician asked, "Won't that break the system entirely?" Zakari smiled with the confidence of someone who had designed security systems for governments and multinational corporations. "Exactly, that's the whole point. We're not patching holes. We're building from scratch." They didn't repair the existing infrastructure. They replaced it completely. Line by line, they rebuilt the entire patient record system: birth certificates, vaccination history, prescription medications, surgical procedures, allergies, emergency contacts, all integrated into one encrypted portal that could function without internet connection and sync daily to a secured internal cloud hosted on servers physically located in Burkina Faso. Day 12, they launched the pilot program in 3 hospitals, one in Ouagadougou, one in Bobo-Dioulasso, and one in Gawa. Within 48 hours, the system had prevented 6 misdiagnoses, tracked 2 allergic reactions that would have been fatal without instant access to patient history, and flagged 1 foreign device attempting to access the database. Zakari traced that IP address back to a server in Virginia, operated by a data broker that specialized in African health information. He didn't publicize the intrusion attempt. He just blocked the address and wrote in the security log, "Try again if you dare." By day 14, the system was running nationwide. Medical staff across the country began receiving training through tutorials that Zakari's team built in French, Moor, and Dioula. No Western platform dependencies. No need for Google accounts or Microsoft licenses. Just local servers, solar-powered routers, and Burkina ingenuity. The impact was immediate and measurable. Rural clinics that had operated with paper files suddenly had instant access to patient histories from urban hospitals. Emergency rooms could identify allergies and pre-existing conditions within seconds of admission. Surgical teams could review previous operations before planning new procedures. Foreign agencies took notice quickly. 1 week after launch, a European Union cybersecurity firm reached out requesting a code audit for quality assurance purposes. The request came with offers of technical support and system integration that would have connected the new system to European networks. Zakari laughed when he read the email and declined immediately. "We're not your testing ground," he replied. "We're your warning, clear and loud." His success wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. For the first time in Burkina Faso's modern history, a core national infrastructure was not dependent on foreign servers, not monitored by external agencies, not leased or borrowed or licensed. It was owned completely by the people whose lives it protected. President Traore made an unannounced visit to the Corps' basement office 3 weeks after the system went live. He didn't bring cameras or reporters. He just sat on a bench beside Zakari and asked one question: "How secure are we now?" Zakari answered without looking up from his screen: "We're not just secure anymore, we're invisible to the ones who thought they owned us." The president stood, shook his hand, and left without a word. The following day, the National Telecommunications Agency invited Zakari to a private briefing, where they showed him evidence that foreign data requests on Burkina citizens had dropped by 96% in just 1 week. He nodded, already working on the next project, replacing imported voting software with an offline biometric system developed entirely in-house. If medical records could be secured, so could democracy itself. He refused interviews with international media but sent one written statement to a Pan-African tech journal. Cybersecurity is not about code. It's about sovereignty and dignity. The younger generation took note immediately. In universities across the country, IT students started wearing T-shirts that read, "The Core, built, not bought." Tech boot camps that had struggled to fill seats suddenly had waiting lists. Local coding schools saw a 400% increase in enrollment. In cafes across Ouagadougou, teenagers spoke not of foreign visas and emigration dreams, but of startup ideas and local innovation projects. The psychological shift was as important as the technical achievement. Technology was no longer something that happened elsewhere and was imported, but something that could be created locally and exported globally. When asked if he missed Silicon Valley, Zakari answered with a smile that carried both satisfaction and defiance. They had satellites, but we had silence. And in that silence, we built something they never expected: our own shield. Cora didn't grow up with fabric. She grew up with silence and longing. The kind that settles into a child's bones when home exists only in stories and photographs that arrive irregularly in international mail. Her mother, Fatimata, worked 2 jobs in northern Italy, cleaning offices at night and caring for elderly patients during the day. The work was invisible and essential, the kind that kept Italian society functioning while ensuring that the women who performed it remained unseen and unacknowledged. Her grandmother Rasmata, a seamstress back in Burkina Faso, used to send little swatches of woven cloth in envelopes that arrived months after being mailed. Each piece was softer than the last, carrying colors that didn't exist in European fashion, and patterns that told stories Cora couldn't read but somehow understood. She kept them in a shoebox beneath her bed in Milan, arranged by color and texture like a museum collection of a homeland she had never known but always carried. By age 12, she was designing clothes for her dolls using those fabric samples. By 16, she was sketching fashion designs that combined the patterns from her grandmother's letters with silhouettes she saw in Italian magazines. By 23, she had already made waves in the European fashion world. Her brand SA, named after her grandmother Serrata's initials, fused Afrocentric patterns with European tailoring techniques learned during apprenticeships with Milan's most prestigious ateliers. Supermodels wore her jackets on runways in Paris and London. Fashion editors called her the Milan Miracle and wrote articles about the young African designer who was revolutionizing European fashion with exotic influences and tribal inspirations, language that made her successful but never made her feel seen. But Cora never felt like she belonged. Not fully. She knew that when people praised her designs, they praised the novelty and the story. The African refugee girl who made it big in European fashion, rather than the origin and the meaning embedded in every pattern and color choice. That all changed the moment she saw the video. It was President Traore's speech, the one that didn't just echo across borders, but deep into the bones of people who had been carrying home in their hearts for decades without realizing it. When he said, "You are our seed, scattered across the world. Now is the season to return." She paused the screen, her breath caught in her throat like fabric snagging on something sharp. For years, Cora thought she had escaped poverty by achieving success in Europe. But suddenly, watching Traore's face on her phone screen, she realized she had only walked away from responsibility, from the possibility of using her skills to build something that would outlast fashion seasons and trend cycles. She packed everything in a single weekend, working with the methodical efficiency of someone who had suddenly seen their path clearly after years of wandering. She canceled 2 shows during Milan Fashion Week, events that would have generated hundreds of thousands in revenue, and secured her place among Europe's most influential designers. She terminated a licensing deal with a European fashion house that wanted to mass-produce watered-down versions of her designs for department store distribution. She boarded a flight to Bobo Dioulasso without announcing her departure to the fashion press that had made her famous. Her friends called it madness. Fashion industry colleagues called it career suicide. Italian newspapers ran headlines about the promising African designer who threw away her European dream. She called it stitching home back together. Upon arrival, she contacted the Ministry of Youth and Women's Empowerment. She proposed not a fashion institute or a traditional design school, but a design movement, a space where young Burkina girls could learn how to take the threads of their cultural past and weave them into something new for the future. The ministry offered her an old storage building downtown that had been used to warehouse textiles imported from China. It was falling apart, roof leaking, walls cracking, floors uneven from years of neglect. Cora said yes without hesitation. Her first act was to paint the outside wall bright yellow, the color of millet flowers during harvest season, and write in bold red letters, "Style is sovereignty." The message was visible from the main road that connected Bobo Dioulasso to rural communities, ensuring that girls traveling to town would see it and wonder what it meant. Inside, she placed her grandmother's old Singer sewing machine in the center of the room like an altar, surrounded by bolts of fabric from 2 worlds. Italian silk on one table, representing the technical skills she had acquired abroad. Traditional Faso Danfani and Kente on another, representing the cultural knowledge she had inherited but needed to reclaim. On the first day of class, 12 girls showed up. Ages ranged from 13 to 22. Some arrived barefoot because shoes were luxury reserved for special occasions. Some came with babies strapped to their backs because childcare wasn't available, and leaving children unattended wasn't possible. All were unsure about what they would find, and whether they belonged in a space run by someone who had achieved success in Europe. Cora welcomed them not with instructions, but with a story that would become legendary among the girls who trained there. She held up a length of Italian silk, smooth, lustrous, expensive material that caught light and reflected it back like water. "This," she said, "is Milan, beautiful, refined, costly. It represents everything I learned about technique and precision and meeting international standards." Then she held up a strip of kente cloth woven by her grandmother's hands. Bold, complex, dense with meaning that couldn't be explained in one conversation. "And this is us, complicated, layered, carrying generations of knowledge in every thread. It represents everything I need to remember about purpose and identity and serving my people." She placed the two fabrics side by side on the work table. "One carries technique," she said. "The other carries truth. We need both, but we honor both differently. In Milan, I learned to make clothes that sell. Here, we'll learn to make clothes that speak." From that day on, the studio buzzed with activity that attracted attention from across the city. Within weeks, the girls were designing dresses that incorporated traditional motifs with modern cuts, jackets that could be worn to office jobs and traditional ceremonies, school uniforms that made children proud to be students rather than ashamed of their institutional clothing. They practiced pattern making by day and learned to dye fabrics with natural materials during evening sessions. Cora taught them to hand-stitch their names into garment linings. "We don't make clothes," she told them. "We make declarations of identity and pride." She refused to charge tuition because education shouldn't be limited to families with disposable income. Instead, she asked only for commitment. "Give me 3 months," she said, "and you'll never be invisible again." Not to anyone. The turning point came during a national youth showcase organized by the Ministry of Culture. Her students walked a makeshift runway inside a community center, wearing designs they had created themselves. Instead of professional models, they used local farmers, market women, school teachers, people whose bodies told stories of real work and real lives. The designs were electric. Modern fits incorporated ancient symbols embroidered into seams. Color combinations referenced traditional pottery patterns. Silhouettes honored both African body types and African climate needs. One dress carried the phrase, "I carry my village on my back," stitched across the shoulders in 3 languages, Moor, French, and English, acknowledging the multilingual reality of contemporary African identity. The audience was stunned into appreciative silence, then burst into applause that lasted longer than the show itself. A journalist snapped a photo of a young girl named Zara Doe, wearing a green and gold pantsuit while holding her baby brother and walking the runway barefoot. That image made the cover of 5 African fashion magazines. The caption read, "The future wears both," referring to the combination of traditional and contemporary elements, but also to the idea that African women could embrace both their cultural heritage and their modern aspirations. Cora didn't care about magazine coverage. She cared about the waiting list that formed within a month of the showcase. 400 girls applied for the next cohort. Applications came not just from Bobo Dioulasso, but from rural communities across Burkina Faso and neighboring countries. A European fashion house reached out offering to fund the school in exchange for co-branding rights and the opportunity to scout talent for European markets. She declined immediately. "We are not a charity case," she wrote back. "We're a return and a revolution." Soon, local demand grew beyond what anyone had anticipated. Schools began requesting custom uniforms that incorporated regional symbols and colors. Wedding ceremonies commissioned outfits that honored both families' traditions while accommodating contemporary celebration styles. Religious festivals turned to her graduates for ceremonial garments that reflected both spiritual reverence and artistic innovation. The local economy shifted in ways economists hadn't predicted. tailoring cooperatives replaced Chinese import shops. Thread suppliers established new supply chains for natural fibers. Embroidery specialists found steady work adapting traditional patterns for contemporary garments. Thread by thread, tradition became not just culturally relevant, but economically profitable. One evening, after the students had gone home to their families and responsibilities, Cora sat at her grandmother's sewing machine and wrote a letter on fabric instead of paper. She folded it carefully and pinned it to the wall where it could be read by anyone entering the studio. "Dear Grandmother Razmata," it read, "you sent me threads and envelopes because you knew I would need them someday. I have woven them into a tapestry that covers an entire generation." Your granddaughter didn't forget. She just needed time to remember how to use what you gave her. When asked by a visiting official what her long-term goal was, Cora didn't mention profit margins or expansion plans or international recognition. She simply said, "I want every girl in this country to know she can create beauty, not borrow it from somewhere else." And just like that, a stitch became a movement that would spread across West Africa and transform how young women thought about their cultural heritage, their economic opportunities, and their power to shape the future through their own hands. Meanwhile, Dr. Noel Damber returned home with a mission that would save lives in ways that European medical training had never taught him to imagine. His name was Dr. Noel Damber, 36 years old, born in Uwahiguya, but raised in the United States after his father won a teaching fellowship at the University of Texas. He had graduated from MIT with a doctorate in biomedical engineering, specializing in diagnostic technology that could function in resource-constrained environments. He spent the last 10 years developing early diagnostic devices for major hospitals, innovations that could detect diseases before symptoms appeared and predict treatment outcomes with remarkable accuracy. He'd been offered permanent residency, tenure at Stanford, and equity in a fast-rising medical technology startup that was valued at over $200 million. But he left it all behind. When he heard Traore's words, "You are our seeds scattered across the world. Now is the season to return." He didn't ask for time to think or consult with advisors or negotiate terms. He didn't ask for a press welcome or government guarantees or infrastructure commitments. He arrived in Ouagadougou with 2 suitcases, one full of electronic components and medical devices, the other full of hope and determination to solve problems that Silicon Valley had never considered worth addressing. Within days of landing, Dr. Damber submitted a proposal to the Ministry of Health that would revolutionize medical care in rural areas. His goal wasn't to build new hospitals or import expensive equipment from abroad. It was to give rural clinics the power to diagnose conditions quickly and accurately before they became fatal. He designed a device the size of a backpack that could be carried by motorcycle or bicycle to villages that had never seen a doctor. Inside, solar-charged batteries that could power the system for a week without grid electricity, a thermal scanner that could detect fever patterns and inflammation, a blood analysis chip that could identify infections and nutritional deficiencies, and a speech-guided AI programmed in 4 local languages that could walk untrained operators through diagnostic procedures. No internet connection required, no expensive maintenance contracts, no dependence on foreign spare parts that might take months to arrive. Just one trained community health worker and the will to serve people who had been forgotten by every other medical system. The ministry was skeptical, but intrigued. Similar devices had been tried before with limited success. Usually they were too complicated for village health workers to operate, too expensive for communities to maintain, or too dependent on infrastructure that didn't exist in rural areas. President Traore wasn't interested in ministry skepticism. "Test it," he said. "Let the land decide what works." Noel and a small team of returning medical professionals took the prototype to a village called Zangogo, 7 hours by truck from the capital on roads that became impassable during rainy season. no electricity infrastructure, no paved roads. One midwife trained by traditional methods. No doctor had visited in living memory. No medical laboratory had ever operated there. When they arrived at sunset, the village chief gathered the community under the baobab tree that served as meeting place, courthouse, and sacred space. He introduced the visiting medical team and explained that they had brought equipment that might help diagnose illnesses that local healers couldn't treat. Before the explanation was complete, a woman ran toward them from the edge of the village, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. Her baby had stopped crying hours earlier. Breathing was shallow and irregular. The infant's skin felt hot to the touch, but the local midwife couldn't determine whether fever was caused by infection, dehydration, or something more serious. They had no laboratory, no transportation to the nearest hospital, no options except waiting and praying and hoping that traditional remedies would be sufficient. Noel unpacked his device under the baobab tree, powered it on with stored solar energy, and placed the baby on a flat surface covered with clean cloth. He attached a blood sensor to the infant's heel, a pinprick that drew less than a drop of blood, but provided enough material for comprehensive analysis. The thermal scanner photographed the child's body, measuring temperature variations that indicated inflammation locations. The blood analysis chip processed cellular samples. The artificial intelligence compared results to diagnostic databases that had been programmed with medical knowledge from around the world, but adapted for diseases common in West African children. The device spoke in soft Moor, the local language. Processing sample, please wait. 60 seconds passed. The village watched in silence as LED lights blinked and quiet mechanical sounds indicated analysis in progress. Children who had never seen electronic devices peered over shoulders. Adults whispered prayers in local languages and Arabic. Then the device spoke again. Infection detected. Neonatal sepsis likely. Recommend immediate antibiotic administration. The midwife burst into tears of relief and recognition. She had suspected infection, but couldn't be certain without laboratory confirmation. Now she could treat with confidence instead of guessing and hoping. She pulled a vial of ampicillin from her basic medical kit, antibiotics that had been donated by an international health organization but had remained unused because she couldn't be sure when they were appropriate. The injection was administered immediately. Within an hour, the baby's breathing stabilized. Within 6 hours, normal crying resumed. By morning, the infant was nursing successfully. The mother approached Noel after sunrise, her eyes swollen from crying tears of gratitude and relief. She whispered, "I have chosen his name, Renaissance, because you brought life back where we had only waiting and fear." Word traveled faster than any communication technology. By the end of the week, Noel's diagnostic device had been tested in 5 additional villages within walking distance of Zangogo. In each location, it identified medical conditions that local health workers suspected but couldn't confirm: early-stage malaria, pneumonia in elderly patients, anemia in pregnant women, complications in childbirth that required immediate intervention. It provided answers within minutes rather than requiring travel that took days and cost more than families could afford. In a region where rural death was often explained as divine will or natural fate, Dao's medical knowledge suddenly became accessible and actionable. The Ministry of Health authorized immediate replication. Within 3 weeks, Noel's laboratory in a converted warehouse in Ouagadougou was producing 30 diagnostic devices per month. Returning software engineers joined the production team, programming the artificial intelligence to recognize more symptoms, understand more dialects, and provide more detailed diagnostic guidance. Returning manufacturing specialists optimized assembly processes so that devices could be built entirely with components sourced from African suppliers. Solar panels were manufactured in Morocco. Electronic chips were assembled in Ghana. battery systems were produced in South Africa. For the first time, a sophisticated medical device was being produced in Africa by Africans for African medical conditions. Hospitals in urban areas were astounded to discover that equipment designed for forgotten villages was outperforming imported devices in reliability, accuracy, and ease of use. The diagnostic AI had been trained on medical conditions that Western devices rarely encountered: tropical diseases, nutritional deficiencies common in subsistence farming communities, complications from traditional healing practices, and injuries typical in agricultural societies. President Traore visited Noel's laboratory without announcement or media coverage. He walked from workbench to workbench, watching engineers calibrate sensors and technicians solder circuit boards. He observed medical students learning to operate devices that could be carried by bicycle to locations no ambulance could reach. He asked Noel directly, "What made you design something this simple when you could have built something more sophisticated?" Noel paused from his work assembling a device destined for a village clinic in the eastern provinces. "Because I remember what it felt like to wait for help that never came," he said quietly. "Sophistication means nothing if it doesn't work where it's needed most." Traore nodded slowly, understanding that medical technology designed for African conditions by African engineers served African patients better than imported equipment designed for European hospitals. "And now," he said, "they don't have to wait anymore." International media attempted to frame the innovation as curiosity rather than breakthrough. A technology blog in London called it an interesting medical device from an unlikely source. A health publication questioned the accuracy of rural diagnosis without Western oversight and peer review. But their skepticism only motivated Noel and his team to expand the program. They began training local youth, high school graduates, not medical school graduates, to operate the diagnostic devices. Training manuals were written at a 6th grade reading level and illustrated with drawings rather than photographs. "This technology is not for medical experts," Noel explained during a radio interview. "This is for communities that the medical establishment never bothered to serve. Places where villagers understand their own health needs better than foreign specialists who visit for 2 weeks and leave with research publications." Within 2 months, the first class of rural health technology operators graduated from a program that combined basic medical knowledge with device operation and community health education. They returned to their villages not just as medical assistants, but as bridges between traditional healing practices and modern diagnostic capability. A small village in the eastern province held a naming ceremony for their first healthy newborn in 6 years, a baby whose congenital heart defect had been detected early and treated before symptoms became life-threatening. The community sent Dr. Noel Damber a video, a baby wrapped in traditional woven cloth, sleeping peacefully beneath a tree while extended family sang celebration songs. The caption read, "Because you made a machine that truly mattered." When asked by a foreign journalist what he missed most about his life in the United States, Noel answered without hesitation, "They had machines that filled entire rooms and cost millions of dollars. I built one that fits in a bag and costs what they spend on coffee each day. But here, it saves a life. That's what matters most." The device now has a name chosen by the communities that use it, Sira, meaning path in Diula, because it provides a path from uncertainty to knowledge, from symptoms to treatment, from village isolation to medical connection. And it's just the beginning. The hum of conversation in the cafeteria wasn't in one language. It was in 10. On any given afternoon at Burkina Faso's National Technology Campus, you could hear Twi, Yoruba, Fulfulde, Wolof, Moor, English, French, Arabic, and 3 kinds of hybrid slang that emerged when brilliant minds from different countries worked together on problems no textbook had ever addressed. But the sound wasn't chaotic. It was electric, the sound of a continent thinking together for the first time in generations. The newest arrivals weren't just Burkina returnees. They came from Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, Benin, Togo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and even as far as Sudan and Ethiopia. Some had university degrees from prestigious institutions. Others had only technical certificates and years of experience. All came with the same purpose: to learn from those who had returned not just to visit home, but to build it. The returnees weren't just professionals anymore. They were teachers, mentors, proof of concept that African solutions could work at African scale with African resources. The cafeteria had become the heartbeat of continental collaboration. There were no assigned tables, no hierarchy based on nationality or educational credentials, just people sitting wherever they felt the intellectual spark. A girl from Accra discussing water purification algorithms with a data scientist from Lagos, a Burkina technician explaining solar battery storage to a Malian agricultural systems designer. They didn't compare degrees or discuss salary histories from their previous lives abroad. They talked about problems they wanted to solve and systems they wanted to build. One student captured the mood perfectly while holding a laptop covered with hand-drawn circuit diagrams. "This isn't a Burkina movement anymore," she said to a visiting journalist. "It's African. We're solving African problems with African minds using African resources." The phrase caught fire. It appeared on T-shirts printed in local textile cooperatives, laptop stickers designed by returning graphic designers, campus walls painted by art students who had never seen their culture represented in technology spaces. Someone painted it above the main laboratory entrance in bold red letters. Not just Burkina, African. Outside news agencies tried to keep pace with developments that defied their usual categories. CNN called it the West African Tech Renaissance. Al Jazeera referred to it as Pan-African Innovation 2.0. But it was a French journalist who accidentally named it most accurately during a live television segment. She had been sent to report on Burkina Faso's return program as a curiosity, an interesting but ultimately unsustainable experiment in African self-reliance. But after spending a week on the technology campus, watching students from 12 countries collaborate on solutions to problems that affected hundreds of millions of people, she found herself reporting something she hadn't expected. "What we're witnessing here," she said with a mixture of surprise and respect, "is nothing less than the second independence." The clip went viral across French-speaking Africa. At the next campus town hall meeting, students broke into spontaneous applause when the video played on the main screen. A girl from Lagos stood up in the middle of the applause, looked around at the diverse crowd of young Africans, and shouted, "Did they think we'd wait forever to be free again?" The crowd roared back in unison, "No." What made the technology campus different from similar institutions in other countries wasn't the buildings. They were functional, but not impressive. It wasn't the funding. There was minimal external investment. It was the curriculum, built entirely by returnees who understood that African problems required African solutions, taught by African minds to African students. The educational approach focused on real-world problem-solving rather than theoretical knowledge that might never be applied. Broken supply chains that prevented rural farmers from reaching urban markets, unreliable power grids that shut down businesses during peak demand, corrupted digital systems that enabled fraud and discouraged economic participation, educational gaps that left brilliant young people without technical skills. Every class required a final project that had to be implemented in actual communities rather than simply presented to professors. Students couldn't graduate with theoretical knowledge. They had to demonstrate practical impact. One team of students designed a battery cooling system that allowed solar panels in desert communities to operate efficiently during extreme heat, extending equipment life by 500% and reducing replacement costs that rural communities couldn't afford. Another group developed a digital land registry application that worked without internet connectivity, preventing land theft and legal fraud in areas where property disputes had destabilized entire regions. Students from Mali built a solar-powered refrigeration system for transporting vaccines to remote health clinics, tested and deployed in communities where childhood diseases had been eliminated within 6 months of implementation. Every success was documented on a giant chalkboard wall labeled "What We Built Ourselves." Every failure was recorded right beside it under "What We'll Fix Next." There were no grades or rankings, only progress, measured by community impact. Returning mentors didn't function as traditional professors delivering lectures to passive students. They served as teammates and collaborators, working alongside students to solve problems that affected them all. Zakari Barrow, the cybersecurity architect who had built Burkina Faso's national digital firewall, held daily open forums where students could challenge his technical decisions and propose alternative approaches. One afternoon, a 17-year-old from Côte d'Ivoire identified a potential vulnerability in his encryption methodology. Instead of defending his work or dismissing her concerns, Zakari spent the next day testing her hypothesis. When she proved correct, he offered her a position on his core development team. "If you're brave enough to question me," he said, with a smile that mixed pride and respect, "then you're ready to lead your own projects." The future belongs to people who think beyond what they've been taught. Word of this collaborative model spread faster than any government could contain or control. Education ministers from 5 West African countries visited within a month, requesting curriculum templates and training programs for their own institutions. A delegation from Rwanda asked for partnerships that could adapt the model for East African contexts. Ethiopian officials proposed a continent-wide technical education network. South African universities inquired about exchange programs that would give their students access to hands-on problem-solving experience they couldn't get in traditional academic settings. A Pan-African Technology Alliance was proposed, not based in European capitals or funded by Western development banks, but grounded entirely in African innovation, African funding, and African control. Burkina Faso had become the nerve center of something unprecedented, a continent-wide movement of young people who were choosing to build Africa rather than abandon it. Foreign embassies began quietly requesting campus tours, hoping to understand and potentially influence what they were observing. Traore's administration declined consistently. "This isn't a museum," one government official replied to a European diplomatic request. "It's a forge where the future is being shaped. We don't need observers. We need partners who will contribute and stay." And they kept building. In the campus cafeteria one evening, during the quiet hour between dinner and evening study sessions, a moment occurred that captured the transformation happening across the continent. A Ghanaian student who had arrived just 3 weeks earlier looked around the room at young Africans from a dozen countries, all working on projects that would improve millions of lives, all choosing to invest their talents in continental development rather than individual advancement abroad. "You know what's different here?" he said to his table mates. "We're not competing with each other anymore. We're connecting. We're not trying to escape Africa. We're building it into something the world can't ignore." A girl from Nigeria nodded, closing her laptop after completing code that would optimize agricultural supply chains across 3 countries. "And we're not begging to be seen anymore. We're building what they can't help but notice." Someone raised a glass of Bissap juice and whispered the phrase that had become their unofficial motto, "To the second independence." No one applauded. They didn't need to. They simply returned to their work, writing code that would serve African communities, designing systems that would strengthen African economies, and building technologies that would demonstrate African capability to the world. It started with a leaked memo, 5 pages marked confidential, from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The document had circulated quietly through diplomatic channels for weeks before someone with access to classified materials decided the world needed to see what European governments were saying privately about Africa's return movement. One line was highlighted in yellow by whoever leaked it. Burkina Faso's return movement presents a credible model for anti-dependency governance that could fundamentally alter our relationship with Francophone Africa. Beneath it, a warning that would prove prophetic. Risk of diaspora-driven national awakening across multiple African states. Recommend immediate countermeasures. The memo circulated through social media faster than diplomatic efforts could contain it. What had begun as a hopeful return movement in one small West African country was being discussed in European capitals as a strategic threat to systems that had functioned for decades without serious challenge. Burkina Faso wasn't just calling its people home. It was proving they had never needed to leave in the first place. In response, France tightened controls that had previously operated through informal influence rather than official policy. Aid packages that had once been offered with handshake agreements now came with detailed clauses requiring specific outcomes measured by European standards. Development grants once provided with minimal oversight now included requirements for external consultancy review, regional cooperation expectations, and compliance monitoring. Diplomatic language for surveillance, control, and continued dependency. In practical terms, French officials wanted to review and approve African government decisions before they were implemented. But the Burkina government didn't negotiate or protest. They simply declined. 2 major aid packages meant for rural healthcare expansion were rejected immediately. By the time the refusal reached Paris, new clinics had already opened across 3 provinces, built by returned doctors, equipped with devices manufactured in local laboratories, powered by solar systems designed by Burkina engineers. The infrastructure existed. The need was met. External assistance was unnecessary. The International Monetary Fund followed with subtler pressure. Loan offers designated for infrastructure development were paused pending policy review. Deadlines were extended indefinitely. Phone calls were not returned. Meetings were postponed without rescheduling. Traditional diplomatic pressure relied on African governments having no alternatives to external financing. But Burkina Faso's roads continued expanding using revenue generated by returned professionals who were building profitable businesses and paying taxes to their own government rather than hiding income in foreign accounts. Solar farms in the eastern provinces came online ahead of schedule. Village schools opened with desks carved from locally harvested wood and textbooks printed on paper, manufactured in Burkina factories. Each completed project proved that African development could proceed without European permission or oversight. Every time international observers asked, "How are they funding this without loans?" the answer remained consistent. With the skills, capital, and commitment of people who came home to build rather than leaving to serve foreign economies. Inside intelligence centers in Brussels and Washington, reports accumulated with increasing concern. The analysis had moved beyond monitoring military alliances or tracking election outcomes. Now Western intelligence agencies were documenting the spread of ideas, measuring the impact of inspiration, calculating the threat posed by successful African self-reliance. One classified assessment read, Burkina Faso is successfully demonstrating non-aligned development strategies that do not require Western technical assistance, financial support, or political oversight. Another report warned more directly, the success of their diaspora return program undermines the foundational narrative that African states require long-term aid dependency and external guidance to achieve modernization. They weren't concerned about military threats or economic competition. They were worried about the power of example, The possibility that other African governments might conclude they could function independently of Western systems that had presented themselves as essential and irreplaceable. By the third month of Mission Renaissance, evidence of continental awakening was undeniable. Applications for similar return programs had increased dramatically in 5 other countries. WhatsApp groups with names like Rebuild Lagos, Return to Dar es Salaam, and Ghana Rising had formed across diaspora communities, sharing strategies and coordinating efforts. Some participants already had departure plans. Others were organizing shipping containers filled with equipment, tools, seeds, and books. The African diaspora wasn't just talking about return. They were preparing for it systematically and collectively. The awakening wasn't theoretical. It was logistical. At a regional conference in Abidjan, attended by development officials from across West Africa, a French representative asked President Traore directly whether Burkina Faso would reconsider participating in traditional aid partnerships that had governed Franco-African relations for decades. Traore responded without pause, his voice carrying the confidence of someone whose policies were producing measurable results. "We don't negotiate our independence anymore. We practice it daily." A few seats away, a Ghanaian delegate whispered to his colleague loud enough for microphones to record. "He just said what we all think but won't admit out loud." Back in Ouagadougou, the changes were visible to anyone who cared to look honestly. Rural clinics in Sabar and Kaya reported their first months and years with 0 infant deaths, not because of imported medicine, but because of diagnostic equipment built locally and medical staff trained at the new National Medical Academy. A returning agricultural cooperative in the Northwest had produced enough millet and sorghum to export surplus grain to neighboring countries, not to former colonial powers, but to African markets that paid fair prices and didn't demand political concessions in exchange for trade relationships. Solar power grids now illuminated 36 rural schools that had operated by candlelight for decades, eliminating dependence on diesel generators that required expensive fuel imports and constant maintenance by foreign technicians. Foreign press coverage attempted to minimize these achievements. A French newspaper headline read, "Burkina Faso chooses risky path forward, framing independence as dangerous, rather than natural." A British columnist described the return movement as a romantic but impractical nationalist experiment, as if African self-reliance were inherently unrealistic rather than historically normal. But data contradicted the skeptical coverage. School enrollment had increased by 23% as families gained confidence in local educational quality. Rural to urban migration had decreased as economic opportunities expanded in agricultural regions. Urban food dependency had dropped by 15% as local production increased. Even underground economic indicators showed improvement. Black market trade routes that had previously supplied contraband goods were losing customers because legitimate businesses were providing products that met local needs at affordable prices. People didn't need smuggled goods when legal alternatives were available, accessible, and appropriate for African contexts and incomes. Still, not everyone celebrated the changes. Former NGO workers found their positions eliminated as local organizations took over programs that had been managed by international agencies for decades. Foreign consultants discovered they were no longer invited to policy meetings where their expertise had been considered essential. Private contractors lost infrastructure projects to cooperatives formed by returned Burkina professionals who understood local conditions and could complete work at lower cost with higher quality. One European development consultant vented frustration on LinkedIn, revealing assumptions that had remained unspoken for years. They're replacing trained international professionals with local volunteers who don't follow established best practices. The post received hundreds of replies, most from African professionals who were those volunteers. The response that went viral came from a returned nurse working in a rural clinic. "We're not volunteers, we're owners now, and that's what scares you." At the highest levels of Western policymaking, strategies shifted from offering partnership to applying pressure. Policy memorandums circulated among NATO allies, recommending coordinated responses to what some officials privately called the African independence problem. Think tanks published reports recommending cultural diplomacy campaigns designed to maintain soft influence over African intellectual elites. Some policy papers suggested economic pressure through trade restrictions. Most advised caution because no one wanted to publicly attack countries that were developing peacefully, democratically, and successfully. The threat wasn't military aggression or economic competition. It was example, the possibility that African success would inspire other colonized peoples to question whether they truly needed foreign guidance to build prosperous, independent societies. And no one in Washington, Brussels, or Paris had a plan to counter the power of that example. The transformation continued accelerating. Construction projects managed entirely by returning engineers. Medical facilities staffed by doctors who had trained in European hospitals but chose to serve African patients. Technology companies developing software for African markets using African languages and African cultural frameworks. Every success story undermined the narrative that had justified decades of intervention, supervision, and control. The sun was soft that morning, casting long golden shadows across the stone courtyard of the National Research Campus in Ouagadougou. The air carried the scent of mango blossoms and the sound of construction, the constant hammering and drilling that accompanied a nation building itself from the inside out. It was quiet but alive with the rustle of pages turning, the low hum of conversation in multiple languages, and the rhythmic sound of pencils scratching notes in notebooks that would outlast the academic year and inform lifetimes of service. Beneath a tall flagpole where the red, green, and gold of Burkina Faso rippled in the morning breeze, students in white coats, work boots, and traditional head wraps moved with purpose between outdoor laboratory stations, indoor classrooms, and collaborative spaces where the future was being discussed and designed. President Ibrahim Traore walked alone across the courtyard. No security detail surrounded him. No photographers documented his steps. No speech was prepared for the occasion. Just him, observing what had grown from seeds he had planted with words spoken into microphones months earlier. As he passed outdoor chemistry stations where two girls mixed traditional herbal compounds with modern pharmacological techniques, students paused their work, not to stand at attention or salute ceremonially, but to look up from their experiments and nod with quiet respect, the kind earned through results rather than demanded through protocol. One student had returned from Johannesburg with expertise in plant-based medicine. The other had never left Burkina Faso, but carried knowledge passed down through generations of traditional healers. Together, they were developing medications that combined ancestral wisdom with contemporary scientific method. He moved slowly past the solar technology wing, where coding students were troubleshooting a mobile application designed to help farmers track local food prices and avoid exploitation by middlemen who had historically controlled agricultural markets. Their screens displayed code written in languages that made sense to rural communities. Interfaces designed by people who understood that technology should serve users rather than requiring users to adapt to technological limitations. Nearby, a robotics group ran field tests on a handmade drone designed to deliver medical supplies to flood zones that became inaccessible during rainy season. The device had been built entirely from components manufactured in African countries, assembled by students who had never seen similar technology but understood the problems it needed to solve. Suddenly, from the biology wing, a voice rang out with excitement that could not be contained or cautioned. "Captain, we found a cure?" The voice belonged to a girl no more than 12 years old, wearing a laboratory coat that was far too big for her small frame, and safety goggles that fogged as she ran excitedly toward the central courtyard. She carried a test tube carefully in both hands, bouncing with pride and discovery, her eyes shining with the kind of joy that comes from solving problems that matter. Behind her, slightly older students followed with notebooks filled with data, measurements, and observations that documented months of patient research. They moved more cautiously, understanding the weight of scientific discovery, but their faces carried the same electric energy of breakthrough and possibility. Traore stopped walking. He turned to face the young scientist and paused, not for dramatic effect, but to fully absorb the moment that was unfolding. Around the courtyard, other students stopped their conversations and experiments to witness something that might be remembered for generations. He didn't smile immediately. He didn't need to express joy or surprise or pride. Everyone present understood what was happening without theatrical gestures or speeches about the significance of the moment. This wasn't staged for cameras or planned for maximum political impact. It was genuine. The authentic excitement of a young person who believed she could heal something and had spent months proving that belief was justified. The cure she had discovered would later prove effective against a strain of malaria that had been resistant to existing medications. Her breakthrough would save thousands of lives across West Africa and establish Burkina Faso as a center for tropical disease research that attracted collaboration from medical institutions worldwide. But in that moment, none of the broader implications mattered. What mattered was a child who had been given tools, space, encouragement, and freedom to think, and had used those gifts to solve problems that adults had considered impossible. As Traore continued his walk through the campus, another voice rose, this time not spoken aloud by any individual, but rising collectively from the energy and purpose that filled every corner of the research facility. We left because we had no choice. We returned because someone gave us one. The camera lens pulled back slowly, expanding the frame to show the full scope of what had been built. Past the Innovation Campus with its laboratories and workshops, past the dome-shaped Diaspora Center where returnees receive support and orientation, past the medical clinics where diseases that had claimed generations were now being treated successfully, past the solar farms that powered rural schools and the textile cooperatives that had replaced Chinese imports with local production. The image widened to show roads lined not with military checkpoints or foreign aid distribution centers, but with families walking forward together. Children clutched books printed in local languages alongside international texts. Elders planted seedlings that would mature into forests managed by their grandchildren. Nurses restocked rural health centers with medications manufactured domestically. Engineers loaded educational software onto laptops that could operate without internet connectivity. The diaspora hadn't returned to visit homeland or volunteer temporarily. They had come to build permanently and systematically, to create infrastructure that would serve the next generation, rather than requiring the next generation to leave in search of better opportunities. In the shadow of the research campus, a new chapter for Africa was quietly unfolding. It wasn't announced with fanfare or marketed through international media campaigns. It was demonstrated through schools where children learned African history alongside world history, hospitals where African doctors treated African patients with African-manufactured equipment, and businesses where African entrepreneurs solved African problems with African capital. Across provinces and regions, neighbors who had been separated by decades of economic migration were learning to communicate in local dialects that had been nearly lost during years of foreign education and employment. Extended families were reunifying as relatives returned from exile that had been presented as opportunity, but experienced as cultural amputation. At dusk, community gatherings featured live music performed by returning musicians who had studied in European conservatories, but chose to innovate with traditional African instruments and contemporary production techniques. The sound was neither purely traditional nor completely modern. It was African music for African audiences, performed by African artists who were no longer trying to be acceptable to foreign markets. Across rural areas, agricultural cooperatives distributed seed packets containing crop varieties that had been preserved and developed by African agricultural scientists rather than imported from multinational corporations that prioritized profit over food security. Heirloom grains, corn, sorghum, fonio, carried genetic memory and climate resilience that enabled farmers to produce food without dependence on expensive fertilizers or pesticides that depleted soil and indebted farming communities. Healthcare workers staffed clinics that had been converted from abandoned school buildings, equipped with solar-powered laboratory equipment and digital health record systems that functioned reliably in locations where internet connectivity remained inconsistent. Emergency medical care was provided by professionals who understood local disease patterns. Cultural health practices and family systems that influenced treatment compliance and recovery outcomes. Engineers repaired infrastructure using technologies that could be maintained by local technicians with locally available materials and locally manufactured components. Roads, bridges, and communication systems were designed to function in African climates with African resources and African expertise. Every innovation felt personal because it had been developed by people who would live with its consequences rather than foreign experts who would return to comfortable homes after completing consulting contracts. Young girls who had previously been told that science and technology were not appropriate career paths for African women now attended coding boot camps led by mentors who shared their cultural background, understood their social challenges, and had successfully navigated similar obstacles. They learned programming languages that could be used to develop software for African markets, solve African problems, and build African technology companies that would employ African workers and serve African customers. Farmers who had been limited to subsistence agriculture received evening technical education at agricultural technology centers, where returned specialists taught data analytics, crop rotation optimization, and sustainable farming practices that increased yields without degrading environmental resources that future generations would depend on. Markets filled with crafts and clothing manufactured by local artisans using solar-powered equipment and traditional patterns that had been updated for contemporary tastes and international quality standards. The pride visible throughout communities wasn't just personal, but continental. People carried themselves differently when their skills were valued, their culture was respected, and their contributions were essential rather than supplemental to economic and social development. Communities organized storytelling events where elders taught young people to preserve genealogical knowledge and historical memory that connected families to places, ancestors, and cultural practices that provided identity and belonging across generations. Schools integrated African mathematical innovations, astronomical discoveries, and philosophical traditions into curricula that had previously focused exclusively on European intellectual achievements and ignored African contributions to human knowledge. History textbooks were rewritten to center African kingdoms, trade networks, and cultural innovations rather than presenting Africa exclusively as a recipient of foreign influence and intervention. Across regional borders, returning professionals maintained regular communication and collaboration. Engineers shared technical solutions. Medical professionals exchanged treatment protocols. Agricultural specialists coordinated seed development and farming technique innovation. They collaborated without waiting for official government approval or international organization oversight. They worked together because they shared common challenges, common goals, and common understanding that African problems required African solutions developed by African minds for African communities. The movement had transcended national boundaries and political systems. It had become a continent-wide network of people who had chosen to invest their talents in African development rather than seeking individual advancement in foreign countries. This was a new Africa, one rebuilt not on foreign aid or external validation, but on skills that had been returned, stories that had been remembered, and confidence that had been reclaimed through practical success and measurable achievement. A continent that was no longer waiting for rescue or permission, but actively rising through its own efforts and creating examples that inspired similar movements worldwide. As the sun set behind the National Research Campus, flags from neighboring countries flew alongside Burkina Faso's colors, symbols of solidarity and mutual support, rather than competition and division. The message was clear without being spoken. African countries could cooperate, prosper, and lead without needing foreign mediation or supervision. And so they had not returned for comfort or nostalgia. They returned because someone had finally believed they should, not a foreign donor or international organization, but one of their own people who had the courage to say that Africa needed Africans more than the rest of the world needed them. President Traore hadn't just welcomed the diaspora home. He had reminded them of who they were before the world convinced them they needed to become something else to be valuable. And perhaps that was the question for anyone watching this transformation. If a leader rises not to be followed blindly, but to help others discover their own strength, would you answer that call? Would you come home to yourself? What part of this story resonates with your own experience? What dreams have you deferred because you thought they were impossible? Do you see your own potential for return to values, communities, or purposes that once seemed impractical but now appear essential? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let this space become a forum where people speak honestly about belonging, purpose, and the courage required to build the future, rather than just surviving the present. If this story moved something inside you, if it reminded you of possibilities you had forgotten or dreams you had abandoned, then engage with it actively. Like the video. Share it with people who need to hear these ideas. Subscribe to support content that challenges conventional wisdom and imagines better alternatives. Thank you for watching and thinking alongside this story. Until next time, remember, Africa doesn't ask permission to rise. Africa remembers who it has always been. And then Africa returns to itself powerfully and permanently. The future belongs to those brave enough to build it themselves.